Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming here during this lunch break. My name is Tomasz Jędrzejewski. I'm working for Motorola Solutions, and today we are going to talk about exceptions. Just one short information, because we have only 15 minutes of time. If you have any questions, just ask me after the presentation. I will be hanging around over here, so you can catch me. And this talk has been inspired by this guy. He's called Chuck Norris, and they say he counted to the infinity twice, or that he can create final abstract classes in Java. They also say that he throws exceptions that can't be caught, Chuck Norris exception, and actually I brought one of these exceptions here to Devox to show you. And here we will have some small demonstration. So this is a very simple example. I'm showing it only for a reference. It should be pretty obvious what this program is going to print. We throw an exception, we catch it. So let's run it. Yeah, and the result is pretty obvious. And now let's replace foo exception with Chuck Norris exception and see what happens. Yeah, this is definitely not the view that we would like to see in production. Chuck Norris exception hasn't been caught, and you know, this is the real original JVM from Oracle. There is no any hidden hack in the virtual machine, but suddenly our exception simply passes through it. Okay, but if catching Chuck Norris exception didn't work, maybe catching a regular exception will work. So another example. Okay, here I replaced only this one line, changing the type to exception. And now I can also show you that Chuck Norris exception, it extends exceptions, so it should work. Yeah, and it doesn't work. Chuck Norris exception, another time it passed through it. Okay, but it's not exception, maybe throwable will help us. So throwable is our ultimate line of defense. Let's try another change. This time we are trying to catch throwable. Let's run it. Yeah, still nothing. Killer exception. It again killed JVM, and we have a Polish word for that, terefereplajtuś. Yeah, so maybe if we create an empty catch clause, maybe this will help. So let's try in this way. Yeah, at the first sight, it looks that it works because we reached this line. However, then suddenly our JVM blown up, and Chuck Norris exception ultimately reached uncaught exception handler. Now, the exception is, okay, dude, what did you do? No, what did Chuck do? Remember, this is a regular JVM from Oracle. The code is on GitHub. You can try it. You can run it on your PC. And to understand what has just happened, we need to take a closer look at the source code and learn some tricks. If I asked you how Java identifies classes, the first answer would probably be by their names. However, this is only partially true because they are identified by the pair, the name and the class loader. Then can be two distinct classes with the same name in JVM, but they must be loaded by different class loaders, and this feature is actually used by, for example, application servers to isolate our applications one from another, because they, for example, may have different versions of the same dependency. And with some help of Java Assist, we can, and bytecode generation, we can use it to hide Chuck Norris exception from being detected. Yeah. So here's our custom class loader, and we make a copy of another class here. And actually, I'm not copying Chuck Norris exception. I make a copy of another class, roundhouse kick, and simply change its name to Chuck Norris exception. This will help me avoiding some problems with class loading during the implementation of further tricks. So we have a copy of our existing class, and now this is the main constructor of Chuck Norris exception. And actually, I'm creating a completely new exception here from the class I've just generated, and then I throw it away instead of the one the programmer thinks he tries to catch. And to avoid detection, I simply replace the stack trace. Why? Because I can. Because in this way, the programmer won't see any difference in the stack trace, and he would think that he still gets his original exception he sees. However, he doesn't. OK, so now we can avoid catching by Chuck Norris exception clause. But what about catching by exception clause? Well, this trick is pretty simple, because we have already made a copy of roundhouse key class, and as we see, this class already extends throwable, so we get this feature for free. Escaping catch throwable clause is much harder. In fact, it's actually impossible, because JVM prohibits us from manipulating the core classes. However, here Chuck Norris exception uses some social manipulation. Let's answer a simple question. What does a typical programmer do when he catches an exception? Well, he gets a message. He prints the stack trace, because everyone loves printing stack traces nowadays. And fortunately, Java allows us to override these methods with our evil implementations. These implementations work as expected only in the uncaught exception handler. Otherwise, they simply rethrow our exception back to the user. And in this way, we can partially escape from catch throwable clause. And small digression here. Chuck Norris exception is checked exception. So the Java compiler should scream everywhere that we are missing one important piece. Throws Chuck Norris exception in every method header. However, it doesn't. Many people think that checked exceptions are enforced by JVM, but in fact, JVM doesn't care about them at all. They are enforced solely by Java compiler, and with some help of generics, we can trick it to throw any exception we like without declaring it. And here's the trick. We need two methods for that, and one of them must accept a generic type. In the second method, we declare it as we want to throw runtime exception, and we use a casting. The compiler warns us that this probably wouldn't work, but then type erasure comes in, everything becomes throwable, and in this way we can throw any exception we like without declaring it. We don't need throws anymore. OK, but let's get back to our throwable. The programmer might be naughty and create an empty catch clause, where this is a very bad practice, so it must be definitely punished. And Chuck Norris exception does it by installing a shutdown hook within JVM. Chuck Norris exception has a flag, roundhouse kicked, which tells us whether the exception has been handled or not. And this shutdown hook simply checks. If the exception hasn't been handled, it kills JVM during the termination phase by throwing our exception back to the user. However, we may JVM may terminate after a very long time. We don't want to wait that much, so this is why we also install yet another thread, killer thread, that simply kills JVM after 100 milliseconds. If the exception hasn't been handled, this triggers the shutdown hook, and yeah, ultimately, Chuck Norris exception always reaches the uncaught exception handler. Yeah. Now one might say, dude, this code sucks. Nobody uses such code in production. Oh, really? So let me Google that for you. And this is from real project I found on GitHub. And you see, exceptions were created to deal with strange situations. Personally, I call Chuck Norris exception every attempt to obfuscate the error handling flow, so that, for example, I learn about some silly problem when my application blows up at 3 o'clock in the morning, that I forgot to handle it. And the programmers tend to obfuscate the exception, the flow, when the application was designed without any idea how to handle exceptions, without an exception handling strategy. So, for example, we are writing some code. Suddenly, the Java compiler starts screaming that we need to handle some exception, but the interface doesn't allow us to do so, and we don't know what to do with it. So here comes Chuck Norris exception for the rescue. Yeah, so we need a strategy. And here's how I do it if I have a boom in my application. Personally, I love checked exceptions. People tend to hate them, but I prefer to learn about some problem from my compiler rather than from the production when my application blows up. And to avoid frustration, I follow 3 simple rules in my design. First of all, I have usually two places in the entire application that deal with handling exceptions. So they can be, for example, at the request boundaries. Then I have about 2 base exceptions that I use mostly in the interfaces to give the programmers the freedom they need. And these base exceptions represent 2 typical situations. So the problems with the application and the problems with the environment of the application. And for point number 3, I have more specialized exceptions for particular problems that I use in the implementation for the documentation purposes. Of course, you can use unchecked exceptions here. You can do whatever you like, even not using exceptions at all. Just have a strategy. And if you can explain it in few words, it's a very good strategy because other programmers will understand it and they may follow it or they may argue with it and maybe find some better approach for your particular problem. So you can only win, and this is the rest is called experience. So have a strategy and don't throw Chuck Norris exceptions in your production code. Thank you. And here's the link to the GitHub when you can find the source code. And this is also explained on my blog in Polish. GitHub is in English, so you can take a closer look at that after the presentation. Thank you once more, and have a nice DevOps afternoon.